Audio check. Teams audio check. Right, good morning everybody. It's now 10 o'clock and the CPO inquiry is, I think, technically resumed, but in any event opened. I'm going to run through a few formalities because I'm conscious that not everybody necessarily on the airport site has been here before. I think those watching on Teams are all people that we know, but obviously I don't know who might be out there, possibly on YouTube, so I'm going to do sort of an abbreviated opening in case there is anybody out there on YouTube. This inquiry today is into the Bristol Airport Limited land at the A38 and Downside Road compulsory purchase order. I'm going to take the convening notice as read, and I'm going to take it that all the statutory formalities have been complied with. Just in case there is anybody watching on YouTube, as you can doubtless see, my name's Philip Ware. I'm a Chartered Town Planner, and to my right is Claire Searson, also a Chartered Town Planner, amongst a number of other things. We've been appointed to hold this inquiry and report on the CPO to the Secretary of State. I'll come back briefly to that matter in a moment. Now, I don't think, given that we know who is on Teams and we know who's in the room, I'm not going to ask who is going to speak, other than in just a moment for the acquiring authority. Just a quick update on correspondence of one sort or another. The Council has come to an agreement and withdrawn its objection, hence not having a witness here or an advocate. And Mr. Lane has also withdrawn his objection, I think yesterday, and he was probably going to be represented here, but obviously now is not. The only other bit of documentation that I've just seen is a response from the Willis Trust, and that, I think, is a response to Mr. Church's supplementary evidence. I've got that response. I haven't, to be honest, gone through it yet, but I obviously will do. So before I just go through...
Can I just check, is it 27th of September?
Hold on.
I'm just checking that I've got it.
1 second. It is, I think it... Let me just check this. I think it's...
I've got it as a 27th of September letter.
Yes, that's it. Yep.
Right, just so
that's
that
the
I'm
one.
sure I've got
So
what
we've got that.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of procedural points, and I guess it's probably best, in case there is anybody on YouTube, perhaps Mr. Humphreys, if you could introduce yourself and your witnesses, and then we'll move on to a few more procedural points before we get to the meat of the inquiry.
Good morning, sir. My name is Michael Humphreys. I'm Queen's Counsel. I'm instructed by Womble Bond Dickinson on behalf of Bristol Airport Limited, the acquiring authority. So I've got two witnesses, Mr. Scott Witchells, who you heard from previously during the highways topic of the main planning inquiry, and Mr. Henry Church, who you haven't heard from before, but you have from him a summary, main and supplementary proof of evidence that have all his qualifications.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've excuse me. We've certainly got all that material. The procedure for anybody who might be listening in is that very shortly now we'll hear an opening statement from the acquiring authority, and then we'll hear from each of their two witnesses in turn. We don't have any objectors here, virtually or physically, so there won't be any cross-examination of those witnesses. We've got a number of questions for those witnesses at the moment, but I've got a strong suspicion that by the time we have heard the opening from Mr. Humphreys, and then those witnesses will be taken through their evidence, I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised if we then run out of questions, but there may be some from us. There obviously won't be any, as I said, there won't be any cross-examination, there won't therefore be any re-examination either. The other point to mention, again, for the benefit of anybody who might be listening, is that technically we started this CPO inquiry way back in July, and the reason for that was simply that we've heard an awful lot of planning evidence during those weeks, and we wanted to be able to take account of that planning evidence in the context of the CPO, and also use the planning core documents that we've been looking at for weeks on end as part of the CPO case. So that was the reason we technically started, so as to wrap it all up together. A couple of other quick points. We've obviously seen, we're now talking about the CPO, we've obviously seen the junctions and we've seen the site on a number of occasions. In the context of the CPO, however, we're going to go back and have a look at the junction in rather more detail after we've heard the evidence. We've looked at the junction, obviously, in highways terms. We've looked at the junction in quite a number of other respects, but we actually want to go back after we've heard the CPO evidence and have a look at it. That, I think, is very likely to be tomorrow. I think, one other matter to raise, and Mr. Humphreys and the Acquiring Authority are well aware of this. As matters stand at the moment, this CPO decision, unlike the Section 78, but the CPO decision is not transferred to us. So as things stand at the moment, we'll be writing a report to the Secretary of State. If that changes, we'll obviously let well, particularly the airport, and just for information, the council will let you know. I don't think, frankly, that if that does happen, I don't think that will actually have any bearing on today's proceedings. It will obviously have a bearing on how we report or decide it. We keep hearing that there is going to be a decision made on such and such a date. The last date on which we were told a decision might be forthcoming as to transfer was actually today, but we've not heard anything. But it may well be that there's a decision coming out on that. Regardless of that, and I've mentioned this before several times in previous weeks, the way that we're going to be dealing with the matters is, firstly, we'll deal with the Section 78 and in passing any costs applications, and then subsequently we'll deal with the CPO as a separate matter. Whether it's transferred to us or whether it's a report to the Secretary of State, we're going to do it sequentially. We've talked about this before, and frankly, I don't think we can envisage any other way of doing it. It becomes mind-bogglingly complex if you try and do the two simultaneously. I think they have to be sequential, so that's the way we're doing it regardless. Okay, that was it from us. Mr. Humphreys, I don't know if you've got any housekeeping points or if you're going to go straight to your opening.
Sir, I'm going to go straight to the opening. You should have, both electronically and I hope now in paper, a short opening statement on behalf of the Acquiring Authority, and also a schedule that we've printed in A3 landscape format over some 4 pages, that plot by plot just summarizes some of the relevant information in relation to each of those plots, which we hope will be a useful sort of aide-memoire for you. And I'll also take each of the 2 witnesses to it so that they can assist you with where we are on the particular landowners for each plot. Unless there's anything else, sir, then I will read out the opening statement. This one, unlike the closing statement on Friday, is not so long that I need to summarize large bits. So if it's okay with you, I will just read it, although I think there's one table that I will probably just say, look, there's a table, and not read it. So this is the opening statement on behalf of Bristol Airport Limited, the acquiring authority. Introduction. On 20th of July 2021, the inspectors opened the planning inquiry into the expansion of Bristol Airport to accommodate 12 million passengers per annum, MPPA. But on that day, they also opened this inquiry into the Bristol Airport Limited, land at A38 and Downside Road, compulsory purchase order 2020. The evidence for the inquiry into the order was, however, programmed to start today following the closing of the planning inquiry. The planning inquiry duly closed on time on the 8th of October, and we now turn to the evidence specifically focused on the non-planning objections to the order itself. The order was made by Bristol Airport Limited, BAL, on 15th September 2020 under the provisions of the Airports Act, the 1986, which I've summarised as the Airports Act. The order has been submitted to the Secretary of State for Transport with a request that it be confirmed. The order is required to support BAL's planned increase in the permitted passenger cap at Bristol Airport, the airport, from 10 MPPA to 12 MPPA, which is the subject of an appeal, and we've given the reference against the refusal by North Somerset Council of the planning application, which we just referred to as the planning application. The planning application includes a number of new infrastructure components on-site and off-site to support the proposed increase in passenger numbers and to ensure safe and efficient passenger movement to and around the airport site. The highway works to the A38 and Downside Road are required to accommodate additional traffic generated by the additional 2 MPPA traffic, and that's we've summarised just in this document as the highway works. The highway works and the airport expansion proposal, the scheme, are described in more detail later in this short opening. BAL is seeking to acquire the land required for the highway works that it has not been able to secure by way of private treaty, which is shown on the CPO map. The determination of the planning appeal has not been recovered by the now Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, and so is for decision by the inspectors. But the application for confirmation of the order is to be determined by the Secretary of State for Transport, with the inspectors writing a report to that Secretary of State with a recommendation. The grant or otherwise of planning permission for the scheme is clearly a material consideration in the determination of whether the order should be confirmed, and this does therefore mean that there will need to be a sequential decision making. The decision on the planning appeal first, with that then feeding into the decision on the confirmation of the order. As the inspectors are both determining the planning appeal for the scheme and writing the report to the Secretary of State on the order, that should, however, allow some working in parallel on the two. BAL accepts that the compelling case in the public interest for the confirmation of the order is the need for and benefits flowing from the grant of planning permission for the scheme, and that if planning permission is refused, then, subject obviously to successful legal challenge to any refusal of planning permission, the order should not be confirmed. And I mention that because a number of the objectors raised a point about, well, this is all premature, you can't confirm the order until you know what planning is. And that's accepted, that obviously there needs to be a positive approval of the planning application. This obviously subject to any legal challenge. This short opening statement draws on and, where appropriate, updates the position in BAL's CPO statement of case and reflects the approach in the guidance on compulsory purchase process and the Critchell Down rules, July 2019, the CPO guidance. It seeks to identify why the powers of compulsory purchase contained in the order are necessary and identifies why there is a compelling case in the public interest for the order to be confirmed by the Secretary of State. Much of the compelling case, however, was considered in relation to the merits of Ball's case at the planning appeal, and so is not repeated here. These opening submissions also address the objections which have been made to the order itself. As the order was made during the time of the coronavirus pandemic, in complying with its notification requirements, Ball took into account the then MHCLG coronavirus compulsory purchase guidance published in May 2020 and then updated shortly thereafter. Notices publicising the making of the order appeared in the Western Daily Press on Thursday 17th of September 2020 and Thursday 24th of September 2020. Notices were also erected on the order land notifying of the making of the order, and Ball has prepared a statement of compliance with statutory formalities that confirms the dates when the statutory formalities were undertaken and appends copies of the relevant notices. And the compliance pack has been, sir, I hope, supplied to you, certainly electronically, and you can have a printed copy if you want one. The period for submissions of any objections to the order expired on 16th of September 2020. By that date, 3 statutory objections and 29 non-statutory objections, with 32 objections being received in total, had been made to the Secretary of State. The non-statutory objections were by persons having no interest in any of the order land that raised general objections to the confirmation of the order. And so obviously I'll later in these submissions towards the end I'll update on what's happened, but that at 16th of October was the position. On 29th January 2021, the Secretary of State gave notice to the acquiring authority that the public inquiry would be held into the order, and case management conferences took place on the 8th of March and 30th of June 2020, and as stated above, the inquiry opened on the 20th of July. So I know much of that is obviously very well known to you. Frankly, I put it here for your convenience when writing your report so that you have the dates and things easily to hand. Description of the order land. The land included within the order to be compulsorily acquired is shown edge red and coloured pink on the order map, and the total area of the land to be compulsorily acquired is approximately 9,293 square metres. The airport is located on the western side of the A38, approximately 11 kilometres from the southwest of Bristol city centre and within the local authority administrative area of the council. Covering an area of 196 hectares, it's situated on a ridge of high ground called Broadfield Down, 183 metres above Ordnance Datum, with the A370 Bristol to Weston-super-Mare Road 4 kilometres to the north, and the M5 motorway 11 kilometres to the west of the site. The total application site area is about 111 hectares. The A38 carriageway is directly adjacent to the airport on its eastern extent. 2 roundabout junctions provide access to the airport site from the A38. The northern roundabout provides access to the northern parts of the airport, including the main terminal building, passenger pickup and drop-off areas, the hotel, the operational facilities, and both short and long stay parking areas. This is also the main access for public transport links to the airport. The southern roundabout, meanwhile, provides access to, amongst other things, the Silver Zone long stay car parking, the maintenance main administrative building, the staff car parking, the taxi waiting area, the free drop-off car park, the staff travel hub, the car rental hub, the aircraft maintenance areas, fire station, Profed hangar, Bristol and Wessex Airport Club, Bristol Flying Centre, and the Western Power Distribution Helicopter Unit. Immediately to the north of the airport are properties along Downside Road. These properties along the southern side of this road fall within the parish of Rington, and those to the north fall within the parish of Blackwell. those properties along the southern side of Downside Road share a boundary with the airport. There's a typo here. To the northeast is the village of Felton, which extends northwards along the A38 and east towards Winford. To the south is the small settlement of Redhill, and beyond is Rington. The Orderland is located to the north of the northern A38 roundabout, which serves the airport. The airport land comprises land both adjacent to the A38 carriageway as well as along Downside Road. And then what I've done in paragraph 7 in the table there is simply set out the plot descriptions, and I don't feel there's any great need to read that. Present ownership and occupation of the Orderland. The Orderland is characterized by land adjacent to the A38 and Downside Road carriageways, including the former quarry on the south side of Downside Road. None of the land comprises buildings other than a mobile home within parts of plots 12 and 13. The CPO schedule contains the names and addresses of all the owners, lessees, tenants and occupiers, Table 1, who have interests within the Orderland, together with other qualifying persons such as mortgagees, beneficiaries of restrictive covenants and other rights holders, Table 2. Table 1 of the schedule contains 22 parcels, of which one is unregistered and a number may contain unknown interests. Table 2 of the CPO schedule identifies other qualifying persons under Section 12(2)(a) of the Acquisition of Land Act, including, as I've already said, interests of a mortgagee and those with access over plot 22. The CPO schedule also identifies statutory undertakers and other like bodies who have or possibly have equipment on, in or over the Orderland. The location of the plots is shown on the map accompanying the CPO, and you can see the footnotes. As well as the main CD list, we do have, as you know, a CPO CD list, and so the CP00 number list are part of the CPO CDs. In order to ensure that the highway works can take place in a timely manner to allow delivery of the scheme, it has been necessary for BAL to continue to seek compulsory acquisition of the Orderland while still seeking to acquire the interest by agreement. The need for and benefits of the scheme and the highway works scheme, the need for and the benefits of the overall scheme were considered at length during the planning inquiry and are not therefore repeated in any detail here. In summary, however, the scheme will A, accommodate forecast passenger demand in order to meet the government's national aviation policy of making best use and wider economic objectives, and claw back the historic leakage of passengers from London's airports, deliver substantial social and economic benefits, supporting national, regional and sub-regional economic growth and the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And this aligns with the West of England industrial strategy and the North Somerset economic plan. C, help meet the UK's global ambitions for increased international connectivity and trade following the UK's departure from the European Union. And D, ensure adverse impacts on the environment and local communities are minimized and secure where possible enhancements. It is clear, however, that the wider need for and benefits of the scheme cannot be delivered without the highway works. Thus, the need for and the benefits of the scheme form part of the compelling case in the public interest for the compulsory acquisition of the land required for the highway works. The highway works, however, also bring their own benefits as outlined below. The highway works, Mr. Witchell's CPO proof deals with the transport-specific need for the highway works and the Orderland, and his evidence covers in particular the need for the scheme and operational capacity, options considered, specific design considerations, construction requirements and Orderland summary, and he also deals with individual CPO objections. The transport assessment showed that the A38 at its junction with Downside Road and West Lane is currently over capacity in the PM peak period in 2018. The subsequent transport assessment addendum, which updated the original transport assessment to take into account, amongst other things, updated passenger forecasts, including the core case, faster case, and slower growth case, shows that, quote, the existing A38 signal junction would operate over capacity for all tests in 2030 during all peak hours, and that the existing A38 junction with West Lane is forecast to operate over capacity in both the 2030 reference case and the 2030 test case. The transport assessment also outlined that the highway improvements, including the highway works proposed as part of the scheme, would deliver the necessary capacity improvements to ensure the A38 at its junction with Downside Road, West Lane, would operate with reserve capacity in what was in the transport assessment, the then 2026 12 MPPA test case, and offer significant improvements to pedestrian and cyclist facilities. The transport assessment addendum does not change the conclusions reported in the original transport assessment and demonstrates that the A38 at its junction with Downside Road and West Lane would operate with reserve capacity in the 2030 12 MPPA test case, i.e. with the highway works. As a result, the highway works are required to allow delivery of the scheme. The analysis undertaken for BAL identifies that the full highway works are required to be implemented as soon as growth exceeds 10 MPPA. Alternative designs were considered, including potentially reducing the extent of the works along an alternative alignment, but it was concluded that the highway works represent the most efficient design to meet the highway requirements associated with the scheme, and this conclusion on scheme preferred option was supported by the council officers following extensive discussions. So in broad terms, the highway works will deliver the following important transport-specific benefits: a major improvement to the do-nothing scenario as a result of the additional capacity to accommodate a further 2 MPPA and relieve significant congestion that would arise in the absence of the scheme and the development in accordance with the National Planning Policy Framework and Policy CS10 of the core strategy. Better facilities for pedestrians and cyclists, which would improve accessibility and safety to local residents by sustainable modes. Improvements to the A38 Downside Road junction as a result of the proposed new access arrangements to the airport tavern. A scheme that accords with the A38 major route network, corridor upgrade proposals outlined in the Joint Local Transport Plan, JLTP4, substantially reduce delays for all road users and improve journey time reliability for public transport services, and a scheme in balance with the wider BAL proposed environmental enhancements, including public transport improvements and traffic management proposals that will form part of the ASAS. The Planning Officer's report to the Council's 10th of February 2020 committee meeting concluded that it is considered that these works would improve traffic flow and safety in the immediate vicinity of the airport and are a proportionate mitigation in relation to the projected impacts arising from the proposed development. The detailed drawings submitted with the application showing the proposed highway works are acceptable, although some final specification will need to be agreed before works can commence, and this can be controlled by planning condition. Description of the highway works and the scheme. The proposed scheme seeks to facilitate an increase in the passenger cap at the airport from 10 to 12 MPPA to support the proposed increase in passenger numbers and ensure safe and efficient passenger movement to and around the airport. The development includes a number of new infrastructure components, improvements to existing facilities, and operational changes. The airport is proposing to undertake significant improvements to the A38 between the main airport access road, being the most northern of the two roundabouts, and West Lane to accommodate any additional traffic generated by that extra 2 MPPA. And the improvements comprise the main carriageway between the northernmost roundabout and West Lane, and this will be increased to in width to allow 2 through lanes to be provided on each carriageway. Widening will be mainly undertaken on the western side of the road, providing an overall width of 16 metres. Level changes, Felton Common Land and residential properties prevent the carriage works taking place on the eastern side. Improvements taper back to join the existing carriageway width some 130 metres beyond West Lane. Further dedicated lane will be provided for northbound traffic turning left into Downside Road with a right turn lane into West Lane. The centre of the carriageway will be hatched or have traffic islands in order to separate traffic flows. Downside Road will be widened to 2 lanes for 80 metres prior to the junction, with the A38 and new access provided into the Airport Tavern car park from Downside Road to replace the current access from the A38, which currently does not meet the necessary highway standards. The junction with Downside Road will remain controlled by traffic signals, but will be linked to new signals controlling the West Lane junction. The junctions will monitor approaching traffic using microprocessor optimized vehicle actuation and will adjust the timings to enhance flow and reduce queuing. The traffic will only be able to turn left out of West Lane, while traffic travelling southbound will remain unable to turn right into Downside Road and will continue to double back at the main airport roundabout with the A38. The existing footpath cycle track will remain on the eastern side of the A38 with a new footway provided north of the West Lane junction. An enhanced footway cycle track will be provided on the western side of the road between the airport and Downside Road, with a footway provided for the section north of the Downside Road tying in with the existing facility north of West Lane. Pedestrian and cycle facilities will be provided within the Downside Road junction, and a pedestrian crossing is included within the West Lane signals, and both junction designs will incorporate dropped curbs. Bus stops will be maintained, albeit adjusted for the new carriageway alignment. The access will also be maintained to the public footpath, which runs along the northern boundary of the land at the Tavern Junction towards Lullsgate Bottom. A table summarising the proposed use of each of the plots, both during and post-construction, is provided in the statement of case, CPO statement of case, at Appendix 3. The proposed improvements are in keeping with the current character of the area, and the road will be constructed with an asphalt wearing course, and anti-skid surfacing will be applied on the approaches to the stop lines. All traffic signals and markings will be provided in accordance with highway design standards applicable to the road and type of road, location, and type of road. The area will continue to have street lighting in line with the council standards and local operations, including dimming at night. Surface water drainage will be enhanced to accommodate the effects of the widened carriageway. The highway works were agreed with the council's officers, and the delivery of the highway works was included within the proposed heads of terms for the draft Section 106 agreement submitted to the council as part of the application and in the council's draft conditions for the application. These heads of terms were agreed with the council officers, and the officers' report stated that A38 Downside Road West Lane Improvement Scheme, it's likely that NSC will implement the highway improvement scheme at the A38 junction with Downside Road and West Lane based on the approved scheme. BAL would meet all costs involved, and NSC would deliver the scheme as soon as practical, but with a backstop agreement that BAL would deliver the scheme via a Section 278 agreement should there be delays to NSC delivery. Formal agreements to be developed. Following a refusal of planning permission, the council has sought further and different transport obligations from BAL, and the parties continued to negotiate appropriate terms right up to the end of the inquiry. The obligations relating to the highway works, i.e. the improvements to the A38, are included at Schedule 3 to the final Section 106 agreement. As stated in the Planning Committee report of 10th of February 2020, however, it is anticipated that the council may carry out the highway works at BAL's expense. If, however, for any reason the proposed highway works are not commenced by the council, then their delivery would revert to a Section 278 process, in which case BAL will be responsible for carrying out the highway works to the council's satisfaction. These scenarios, including the transfer of funds, are set out in the Section 106 agreement, and I'll actually return to this slightly later. There is a separate land agreement between BAL and the council. Justification for the use of the enabling power. On 27th of August 2020, the BAL board formally resolved to make the order under the Airports Act 1986, the Airports Act. In resolving to make the order, the board considered the effect of the proposed compulsory purchase on human rights under the Human Rights Act 1998, as set out at Section 17 of BAL's statement of case, and on equalities under the Equalities Act 2010, as set out at Section 18 of BAL's statement of case, and then again, both of those are the CPO statements of case. BAL is the relevant airport operator for Bristol Airport, being the company responsible for the management of the airport. BAL holds a certificate from the Civil Aviation Authority under Section 57A of the Airports Act. Accordingly, under Section 58 and Schedule 2 of the Airports Act, BAL is deemed to be a statutory undertaker for the purposes of the Acquisition of Land Act 1981. As a result, BAL, on being authorised to do so by the Secretary of State, has the power under Section 59 of the Airports Act to acquire land compulsorily for any purpose connected with the performance of the airport operator's functions. As set out earlier, the highway works are necessary for the performance by BAL of its functions in ensuring continued effective operation of the airport in accordance with the scheme to be delivered pursuant to the application. Whilst freehold interests are sought over all of the land, some of the land is required only for construction purposes, for example, for working space to allow the highway works to be constructed. Some of that land may also be needed may also need to be subject to permanent new rights, for example, for diverted services or drainage rights. Compulsory purchase powers do not currently allow the temporary acquisition of land, since the relevant provisions of the Neighbourhood Planning Act 2017 are not yet in force. In addition, BAL does not consider that, in these circumstances, it could rely on Section 59(3) of the Airports Act to acquire new rights over land, since such rights sought do not fall within the categories listed in Section 44 of the Civil Aviation Act 1982. And there are two acts here. I've referred to that one as the Aviation Act. So there's the Airports Act, which is the 1986 Act. Where I refer to the Aviation Act, I mean the Civil Aviation Act 1982. The permanent rights sought would be in connection with off-airport highway mitigation works, as opposed to rights required for the construction of airport infrastructure. As a result, BAL does not consider that it could rely on Section 44 of the Aviation Act to request that the Secretary of State make an additional compulsory purchase order to acquire permanent new rights for temporary construction areas required for the highway works. So the reason for putting there the additional in brackets is that under the Airports Act, we make an order which goes then to the Secretary of State for confirmation. Unfortunately, under the Civil Aviation Act, we don't make the order, we request that the Secretary of State makes the order. So had it been possible, it's not, had it been possible for us to use the Civil Aviation Act, there would have been two compulsory purchase orders, one under one act where we make it and ask for confirmation, one under the Civil Aviation Act where we simply request the Secretary of State to do so. So that's why I've put there additional. My advice to the client, though, is, having looked at this obviously a long time ago, is that the powers under the Civil Aviation Act do not apply in this case, and that is why because we're not authorised to acquire new rights, we've had to acquire all of the land freehold under the Airports Act. Since BAL is not authorised to acquire new rights over land to use as construction areas for the off-airport highway works, and nor is it able to take temporary possession powers over such land, it must acquire the order land permanently, even on plots where BAL does not propose to undertake permanent highway works. However, BAL undertakes to offer back land which is not required permanently to the original landowners, subject to BAL retaining any necessary rights relating, for example, to diverted services and drainage, and subject to other terms being agreed, including as to compensation. The order land falling within this category is plots 4, 6, 11, 13, 15, 17, and 22. BAL has, however, continued to negotiate with effective landowners to acquire the necessary use of the land and the rights by agreement. And so you may have come across this. I've certainly come across it before. It's not unusual for this to happen, and this sort of undertaking to offer back is the conventional way of overcoming this problem, where you can only acquire land permanently but don't need it in the long term. As well as having powers of compulsory purchase in respect of the order land, BAL will rely on Section 203 of the Housing and Planning Act to override third-party rights over land and convert them into a claim for compensation. This will then enable the highway works to be carried out without the beneficiaries of rights being able to obtain an injunction against BAL or its successors in title. Instead, as stated above, the former beneficiaries will have a right to claim compensation. BAL has already acquired the properties known as Highlands and Greenacre, so that parts of the rear gardens of those properties which have a frontage but no access onto the A38 do not need to be included in the order. In order to deliver the increase in passenger numbers to 12 MPPA as part of the scheme, BAL needs to secure the order land to be able to deliver the highway works. Without the use of the compulsory purchase powers, there is no guarantee the acquisition of all the interests through private treaty could be achieved within the timescales envisaged for the highway works, and in turn the expansion of the airport to proceed. Discussions with affected parties have continued with a view to securing the acquisition of interests and reducing the number of interests which need to be acquired compulsorily. Timescale for delivery. What I've done, sir, here in the original statement of case, this was quite brief, but since we now have Schedule 3, I thought it just might be quite useful to pull out some of the relevant bits of Schedule 3 so that you could see the way in which they operate. So the timescale for the delivery of the highway works is covered by Schedule 3 to the Section 106 agreement. The timing depends on who is to undertake the works. This is to be agreed between BAL, who in the agreement are referred to as the owner, in the Section 106 agreement, and the Council pursuant to paragraph 9 in Schedule 3 to the Section 106 agreement, which provides as follows. Both parties will use reasonable endeavours to agree who will undertake the A38 highway works no later than 31st July 2022, in the event that the Council has not communicated its decision in writing to the owner on whether it wishes to deliver the A38 works by 31st of July 2022, then the owner will have the option to deliver the A38 highway works. And then in the event that BAL undertakes the works, then paragraph 10 of Schedule 3 provides that in the event that the owner undertakes the A38 works in accordance with paragraph 9 or paragraph 12, and subject to there not being any delays in program due to force majeure events, the owner covenants to complete the A38 highway works before the 10 MPPA trigger date. And force majeure events are a defined term. I haven't set that out, but I have in the next paragraph set out what the 10 MPPA trigger date is. So the 10 MPPA trigger date is defined, and I give you the PDF page in the Section 106 agreement so you can easily find it. It's quite a long agreement. The 10 MPPA trigger date is defined in the Section 106 agreement as the date on which the latest monitoring report provided by the owner to the Council in accordance with the 12 MPPA planning permission shows that the terminal throughput first exceeds 10 million passengers over a 12-month period. So where the council undertakes the works, then paragraph 11 of Schedule 3 provides that in the event that the council undertakes the A38 highway works in accordance with paragraph 10 above, the owner covenants to pay the council the owner's contribution in accordance with the payment schedule, and the owner shall offer to transfer to the council on reasonable terms at nil cost, including the council's reasonable legal costs incurred in negotiation, preparation and completion of any such transfer, the highway land, and offer a license in accordance with the provisions of paragraph 14 below to the agreement for the A38 highway land. And Schedule 3 also provides for BAL to elect to carry out the works in the event of the circumstances in Schedule 12 and 17. So I haven't set out the provisions more generally. The only purpose here was to give you a broad understanding of when these works need to come forward, and obviously that depends on the terms of the agreement, and I've tried to set out that in a helpful, I hope, way. The council has proposed a planning condition that states that the passenger throughput at the airport shall not exceed 10 million passengers per annum, to be taken from 1st of January to 31st of December in any calendar year, and no car parking hereby permitted shall be brought into use unless and until the A38 highway works shown in the drawing, long number, have been completed in full and are open to traffic. BAL's position is that the requirement to deliver the highway works before the airport exceeds 10 ppA is already secured by Schedule 3 above, and that there is no justification for the requirement to not to bring the additional car parking into use until the highway works are completed, as car parking demand is not directly correlated to junction capacity. I just give an example here. For example, Cog Loop 1, the year-round use of the existing seasonal car park is required to meet winter parking demand when flows through the junction are lower than the summer peak. And that's one of the reasons, and I won't reopen this, but one of the reasons why we don't think that that condition is appropriate, but we think the timescales for delivery of the works are in any event secured in the Section 106 agreement. Planning policy and planning position. The planning policy context for the grant of planning permission for the highway works is set out in the statement of case for the planning appeal and should be referred to, but is not reproduced in full here. Mr. Melling has produced an appendix to his proof of evidence that deals specifically with planning policy related to the order, and you can see, sir, you'll recall that was Appendix C to his main proof of evidence, which was in effect a small planning proof relating to the highway works. And I've set out there what that evidence covers, and it dealt in particular, you can see, with a lot of the order objections. I won't read out the list, and you'll recall, of course, Section 5 of his evidence on the Greenbelt also dealt with that discrete issue about whether the highway works are inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, and again that point is picked up and cross-referred to in this appendix. This evidence must be read, however, in the context of Mr. Melling's overall planning evidence. In terms of the scheme, Mr. Melling concludes that the development is in accordance with the development plan and national planning policy, and that there are no other material considerations which indicate that planning permission should be refused. He indicates that the scheme will make best use of Bristol Airport's existing runway, delivering the UK's national aviation policy and wider economic objectives, and delivering substantial material benefits in terms of jobs, prosperity and increased connectivity, whilst ensuring that adverse impacts on the environment and local communities are appropriately minimised and mitigated. Mr. Melling concludes that the need for and significant benefits of the scheme outweigh the limited adverse impacts associated with increasing the capacity of the airport to serve 12 MPPA, and such that planning permission, the planning appeal should be allowed. And overall, Mr. Melling concludes that BAL is able to demonstrate that there are no sound reasons as to why planning permission for the scheme, including the highway works, should be withheld. Further, there are no objections pertaining to planning matters, which mean that the order should not be confirmed. Funding. Financial approval was obtained in September 2018 for funding to proceed with acquisition of the land for the highway works, and since then BAL has continued discussions with affected parties, with the acquisition of the properties of Greenacre and Highlands achieved by agreement and approved by the board. BAL has sought to acquire the remaining interest in accordance with that approval. The figures for financial approval are commercially sensitive, obviously so given the ongoing negotiations for acquisition. The funding of the highway works will be confirmed once the order powers are confirmed. And BAL has a strong track record of capital investments. In 2018, this amounted to £20.3 million, which included the new administrative building, multi-storey car park and the new fire station. In 2019, the total spend was £46.6 million. Whilst the final cost of the highway works will be settled as part of the tender process, BAL is confident that it has the capital resource to be able to fund them. The cost of the highway works, including land acquisition, is relatively low when considered in the context of the wider scheme costs. BAL anticipates funding the construction of the highway works as part of its operational costs, with the costs of the wider scheme being funded through equity and/or debt finance. Special considerations affecting the order land. Whilst plots 9, 16, 17, 18, 20, 19, 20 and 21 are listed as being owned by Highways England, now National Highways, the A38 has been detrunked, as explained in the statement of case, and the parcel should have been transferred to the council. So BAL does not consider that this is special category land. Whilst BAL seeks to compulsorily acquire land belonging to the council as highway authority to allow delivery of the highway works under section 57A of the Airports Act, BAL is deemed to be a statutory undertaker. As a result, under section 917 of the Acquisition of Land Act, the order would not be subject to special parliamentary procedure. Plot 21 falls within and on the western boundary of the Felton Common area. The total area of this plot is approximately 31 square metres and is less than the 250 square yards, and in any event, the 250 square yards obviously coming from section 19, and in any event is needed for the widening and drainage of the existing highway. It is adjacent to the current A38 highway and is in the ownership of National Highways. It's also located to the west of the existing cattle grid on West Lane. There is some uncertainty as to whether this land is in fact common land, given its location to the west of the existing cattle grid on West Lane, which separates it from the rest, from the vast majority of Felton Common, and given it is owned by National Highways. There may simply be some error here, we think, in the mapping. The giving of exchange land is unnecessary, whether in the interest of any person entitled to rights of common or other rights, or in the interest of the public due to the size and proximity of the plots to the highway and the remainder of the common. As such, it's not considered that the order should be subject to special parliamentary procedure, and the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs has been asked to certify accordingly under section 19 of the Act, and the provisions of section 19(1)(b) apply. The order also seeks to discharge plot 21 from all rights, trusts and incidents under section 19(3) of the Acquisition of Land Act 1981. This is being done on a precautionary basis since the rights over plot 21 are uncertain. BAL has made inquiries of the council as the Commons Registration Authority, but due to the pandemic has been prevented from accessing the documents listed on the Felton Common Register, to assess whether Plot 21 in fact forms part of the common, and if so, what rights may apply over it. The Council has now provided some of the documentation referred to on the Felton Common Register to allow BAL to confirm those rights which do not apply. The revised list of rights has been shared with the Secretary of State for Environment and Rural Affairs, and BAL is seeking to agree this list of rights with the Council in its role as Commons Registration Authority. In addition, further documentation referred to on the Felton Common Register is awaited from the Council. So I'm not sure whether that needs further update. I'll check that some of this is based on some of the earlier documents, and it may have moved on, so I'll just check that. In the meantime, BAL is continuing with its precautionary approach of seeking certification from the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs under Section 19 of the Acquisition of Land Act. The Secretary of State has notified its intention to issue the required certificate, and this intention was advertised accordingly. The period for representations or objections to be received in relation to the Secretary of State's intention to issue the certificate expired on the 8th of January 2021. No objections or representations were received, and the Commons Casework team confirmed on the 2nd of March that the Section 19 certificate can be issued if the decision is taken to confirm the order, and I've given the footnote there, which is to the exchange of emails. Details of attempts to acquire interests by agreement. Negotiations to acquire the land required for the highway works, including the order land, have been ongoing for some time, since before the application was submitted. BAL has already acquired 2 properties, as mentioned before, Greenacre and Highlands, located to the south of Plot 1. The rear proportion of the gardens of those properties, which, as explained above, have a frontage but no access to the A38, will be required for the highway works. As they have already been acquired, they do not form part of the order land. BAL has appointed CBRE to support it in promotion of the order, including engaging with affected parties in an attempt to acquire all interests required for the highway works by agreement in advance of the use of compulsory purchase powers. Whilst Highways England, now National Highways, is registered at the Land Registry as the owner of plots 9, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 and 21, the equerry understands these parcels should have been transferred to the Council, as I've mentioned earlier, when the A38 was detrunked as part of the Exeter Leeds Trunk Road, Sidcutt Lane, A371, Winscombe to Bristol City boundary, Bedminster Down, brackets, detrunking order 1977. They certainly knew back then how to snappily entitle a detrunking order. But no formal land transfer took place and the title has not been updated. Actually, for a long time, we couldn't find that, and we only had the London Gazette, but I think some work by Womble von Dickinson has eventually turned this up, and so Mr. Church's Appendix HC7 contains a copy of the detrunking order itself and the accompanying plan, and a copy of the schedule to the London Gazette dated 24th of March 1977, advertising the detrunking is also available, and the schedule confirms that, and I won't read it out, but it just confirms that the road has been detrunked. The acquiring authority has sought to confirm the extent of the land transferred and whether this included the order land as well as the highway forming part of the trunk road, but are unable to do so without sight of the plan accompanying the order. The plan, when you look at it, is a very large-scale plan. It's almost impossible. You know, it's just a line on an ordnance survey plan, and there doesn't seem to be anything more detailed. Set out in their letter of objection, the Council do not consider that the land has been transferred to them, and the order is therefore essential for these plots to allow acquisition of the necessary interest by BAL to provide certainty of ownership to allow the highway works to proceed. There's certainly been no objection from Highways England, now National Highways. They insist that it's not theirs. The Land Registry entry just shows that it is, but there's no objection from National Highways. BAL and CBRE have been in contact with all parties with a confirmed and identifiable interest from whom permanent acquisition is required, and offers have been made. All parties who have the benefit of rights, easements and covenants in the land which are affected by the compulsory purchase order and known to the acquiring authority must be served with notices of the making of the order. Diligent inquiries have been carried out to identify these parties, but if there are any other parties who have not been identified and who are within it, they may still be notified of the order by posting the posting of the notices on site. So everyone, either by letter or by the notices posted on site, is deemed to have notice. BAL remains committed to seek to acquire all interest by agreement. And then response to objections as identified above. When the period for submission of any objections to the order expired on the 16th of October 2020, a total of 3 statutory and 29 non-statutory objections had been received to the order. The statutory objectors to the order at that time were the Hawthorne Leisure Mantle Limited, which I think had been given the number objector 1, with plots 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. The trustees of the JV Wills Will Trust, which had been given the title objector 2, plots 1 and 2, and the North Somerset Council, objector 4, plots 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, 12, 13 and 22. On the 11th of August, a further late objection to the order was made by Southern Property and Legal Services Limited in an undated letter on behalf of Andrew Lane, who I think becomes objector 33, who is a lessee of the Airport Tavern, plots 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. So in other words, the same as Hawthorne Leisure Mantle Limited. This late objection was accepted by the objectors, as we confirmed so the other day. On 11th of October, however, both North Somerset Council and Andrew Lane withdrew their objections, leaving 2 statutory objectors and 29 non-statutory objectors. There were a number of common themes in the objections received to the order, and in order to avoid repetition, BAL grouped these objection themes into 7 categories, and I list them there. BAL provided its responses to these categories of general objection in the table provided at Appendix 4 of its statement of case. In addition, Appendix 4 also sets out BAL's responses to those issues which are unique to the relevant objection letter. So there were a few that were unique, but most of them were thematic. Section 4 of Appendix C to Mr. Melling's proof of evidence also responds directly to various general planning objections to the order, and in addition, Mr. Church's Appendix HC6 contains a helpful schedule that signposts where BAL's planning evidence generally responds to the issues raised by the general objections to the order. So, for example, some of the general objections suggested that there wouldn't be recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and the order wasn't therefore needed. So that schedule points to wherein, for example, Mr. Brass's evidence, that issue is dealt with. So we believe through a combination of Appendix 4 to the CPO statement of case, Mr. Melling's Appendix C, where he addresses, again, some of the planning issues, and in Appendix HS6 to Mr. Church's evidence, you should have all you need and all the cross-references you need to find out our position in relation to these thematic sort of general objections. In general, BAL's position is that those wider planning objections to the order are in effect objections to the planning appeal itself and have been adequately dealt with during the 9-week planning inquiry. In its evidence for this part of the inquiry, therefore, BAL will focus on the compulsory purchase objections from the statutory undertakers, and in particular, the 2 remaining statutory undertakers, namely Hawthorne Leisure, Mantle Limited, Objector 1, and the trustees of the JV Wills Will Trust, Objector 2. BAL will call Henry Church of the property consultancy CBRE to give its evidence in relation to these objections. Mr. Church has a main proof of evidence, a summary, and a supplementary proof of evidence that updated the position on objectors as at September 2021, and obviously he can orally update you further insofar as that's necessary. Mr. Church's evidence will explain the background to the order, the framework for securing the necessary powers, BAL's position in relation to the objectors to the order, BAL's position in relation to parties with whom negotiations continue, and agreements with affected persons, and his conclusions. To help the inspectors understand the need for each plot, whether the landowner has objected, and the status of any negotiations, Mr. Witchells and Mr. Church have produced a short A3 schedule that summarises the up-to-date position, and it's hoped this will be a useful aid memoir. What I didn't try to do in the opening was summarise our response to the two objectors, in part because we didn't know until the last moment who was going to be a remaining objector and who wasn't, and there needed to be something left for the witnesses to say, and so we thought we would deal with it in that way. But one of the things that I intend to do in the evidence is ask the witness to read their summaries and then probably go to this table and just for each of them in relation to the particular responsibilities of each, get them to talk you through why a plot is needed or where they've got to in negotiations. But as a generality, our position on all of those objections is set out in the written evidence. So conclusions, BAL submits that there is obviously a compelling case in the public interest that the Secretary of State should confirm the order, that it has justified the extent of the order land and the powers it seeks to exercise to acquire that land. The BAL has observed the CPO guidance, that it has genuinely sought to acquire the order land by agreement where possible, and that the objections of affected parties, affected persons, do not lead to the conclusion that the order should not be confirmed, and or that any plot should be excluded from the order. In all the circumstances, so we will ask that the inspectors recommend that the Secretary of State for Transport, the inspectors recommend that the Secretary of State for Transport that the order should be confirmed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Humphreys, Ms. Noble. Let's take a break now, and then we'll come back and look, as you say, at individual plots, the need for them, and where we are on negotiations.
Perfect. And do you want the witness which side is going to be most convenient?
We're a little bit lopsided at the moment. I think probably.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to do to have the witness here because then we're sort of all closer as there aren't many other people in the room. So we'll adjourn now.
12:30.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. Right, okay, 11:30, so Mr. Humphreys, over to your first witness.
Thank you. So I'll introduce Mr. Witchell. So is your name Scott Witchells?
Yes.
So Mr. Witchell's qualifications and experience are set out in section 1.1 of his CPO proof of evidence, and you have also heard from him before.
Of course.
If we could dispense with
Sure.
my reading all the things about his experience. Sorry. That would probably be good. What I will just draw attention to those, in his main CPO proof, Mr. Witchell's in section 1.3 talks about the scope of this evidence, and he also makes the point in paragraph 1.3.2 that to avoid duplication he draws upon and cross-refers to his evidence for the planning appeal.
Yeah.
Clearly there's a crossover between the two,
Yeah.
and so we're not going to cover things that are covered there. Mr. Witchells, you've got a summary proof of evidence. Can I ask you just to read through that to the end, and then what I'm going to then do is get you to take the inspectors through the orderland plot by reference to the schedule and the CPO order map, and then in your main proof of evidence at appendix, I think it's D, you've got the plan that shows the proposed works, and so what's going to be, I think, helpful to the inspectors is if you, when you finish reading through the summary, you just walk the inspectors through bit by bit, how does it work, why is it needed, and so on. So that's helpful to you.
Yep.
Yeah. So, Mr. Witchells, if you just then take up your summary proof of evidence and just start reading from section 1, A38, Highway Improvement Scheme.
Thank you, yes. The main highway's access to Bristol Airport is provided by the A38 corridor connecting to one of two roundabout accesses on the A38. The northern roundabout provides access to the main terminal building, public transport interchange, drop-off area, short stay and premium long stay parking. The southern roundabout provides access to long stay car parking, known as Silver Zone, staff parking, and the recently completed administration building. A separate access on Downside Road is restricted for use by operational, logistics and emergency vehicles. As part of the application to increase passenger throughput to 12 million passengers per annum, BAL is proposing to develop a new airport surface access strategy to mitigate the impact of the development. The ASAS, summarised in section 4.5 of my planning appeal proof of evidence, sets out is the framework that sets out the measures BAL intends to implement, working with the Air Transport Forum and other delivery partners, in order to achieve more sustainable surface access targets and objectives for the airport, the key objective of which is to achieve a 2.5% further shift to public transport use as part of the 12 million PPA application. In addition, it's proposed to improve the A38 north of the airport from the northern roundabout through to just north of West Lane. In this section of the A38, the existing signal junction of A38 Downside Road and A38 West Lane Priority Junction are predicted to operate well over capacity in the core forecast assessment year 2030 without development, which we call the reference case. Long queues and delays are predicted on all approaches, affecting all road users, including public transport services. The junctions also lack suitable pedestrian and cycle facilities. It's proposed to widen the A38 from 1 to 2 lanes through this whole section, widen Downside Road to 2 lanes approaching the junction, signalise the West Lane junction, provide a new pedestrian cycle path between the airport roundabout and Downside Road, and provide new pedestrian and cycle crossing facilities at the signal junctions, shown in Appendix A. These improvements, known as the A38 Highway Improvement Scheme, or the scheme, have been developed and refined based on a range of options through discussions with NSC since 2018 to the proposed scheme, and would deliver a significant increase in capacity to accommodate traffic growth and the development traffic to 12 mppa, along with the provision of new pedestrian and cycle crossing facilities. Based on a series of robust forecast assumptions, the improved A38 scheme is predicted to operate within capacity in all peak periods for the 2030 with development test case. Comprehensive independent review by NSC officers, their consultants, Jacobs, Highways England and their consultants endorsed the methodology and the findings of the Transport Assessment Report in the Planning Appeal Document 291 and in the supporting supplementary information, including the Transport Assessment Addendum, CD 220.4, that demonstrated both the need for the scheme and that the scheme would operate within capacity in the test case. Prior to the NSC committee, agreement had also been reached with NSC that the proposed A38 Highway Improvement Scheme was required and proportionately mitigated the traffic impacts of the development. The scheme requires the acquisition of the order land, so in Appendix B.
You turn in section 2 to the objections to the order and briefly summarise your evidence there.
Yes, there's no stated reason for refusal by NSC relating to the scheme, including any detailed matters of design. There are 9 traffic and transport related objections to the CPO order. These relate to contrary to planning policy, traffic impacts, impact on local residents regarding access, lack of rail or motorway link, safety of airport tavern access, and impact on the A38 major road network project. The proposals, sorry, my things just jumped. The proposals are in accordance with policy requirements of MPPF Para 108 and 110, as set out in Planning Appeal Document 5.8, and CS10, Transport and Movement of the NSC Core Strategy, since they both deliver a comprehensive highways mitigation package agreed with Highways England and previously agreed with officers and their advisors at NSC, propose significant improvements to public transport services and infrastructure, and include a broader package of measures, targets and monitoring to reduce the proportion of car trips to the airport. The traffic impacts of the development are mitigated by the A38 scheme as demonstrated by detailed capacity testing. Access to all properties will be maintained with no significant changes proposed to the eastern side of the A38 as shown on the scheme proposals drawing. Assessments have demonstrated that Bristol Airport will operate effectively without a direct rail or motorway link. It is proposed to relocate and improve the airport tavern access to provide a safer access. The A38 scheme as proposed forms part of the MRN project, so it's inconceivable that it will jeopardise the whole MRN project as stated by NSC. I do not believe that any of the objections to the order are justified.
And then you get to your conclusions. I should say so. Many years ago, I was doing a planning inquiry, and at the luncheon adjournment, I heard a mother explain to her daughter, "You know which ones the barristers are. They're the ones that read out the headings." It's good to have something useful to do. So, your conclusions,
yes,
Mr. Witchells.
In conclusion, the A38 improvement scheme will deliver a major improvement over the do-nothing scenario as a result of the additional capacity to accommodate a further 2 mppa and relieve significant congestion that would arise in the absence of the scheme and development in accordance with MPPF and CS10 of NSC's local plan. Better facilities for pedestrians and cyclists, which would improve accessibility and safety to local residents by sustainable modes. Improvements at the A38 Downside Road junction as a result of the proposed new access arrangements to the airport tavern. A scheme that accords with the A38 MRN corridor upgrade proposals outlined in JLTP4, that's Joint Local Transport Plan 4, substantially reduced delays for all road users and improved journey time reliability for public transport services, and a scheme in balance with the wider BAL proposed environmental enhancements, including public transport improvements and traffic management proposals, which will form part of the ASAS. The detailed design of the proposed A38 improvement scheme is not a reason for refusal of the planning application of the appeal proposal, and nor is the potential prejudice to the MRM project. A significant number of options were explored to deliver the above objectives whilst minimising third-party land requirements and effects to property and environment. The improvement scheme proposed is the optimum layout of some 10 detailed schemes explored. There are no sound reasons as to why planning permission for the appeal proposal, including the proposed A38 highway improvement scheme, should be withheld. The proposals are in accordance with the policy requirements of NPPF Para 108 and 110 and CS10 Transport and Movement of the NSC Core Strategy 2017. I believe that the significant public benefit derived from the A38 improvement scheme will outweigh the private loss, and that there is a compelling case in the public interest to implement the scheme, and that the CPO requirements for the scheme have been fully justified. Further, there are no objections pertaining to highway matters, which mean that the order should not be confirmed. I therefore request that, subject to the planning appeal being allowed, the order should be confirmed.
Mr. Richards, thank you for that. Now, what I would like us to do, by reference, I think, to 3 documents, is just take the inspectors through the plot so that they can understand the justification for the acquisition. And the 3 documents, I think, are the CPO schedule, plot-by-plot summary sheet that was handed in this morning, a copy of the order plan just so that we know where each plot is, and then I suggest the plan at your Appendix D, improvement proposals, drawing number Rev 11, which is, as I say, Appendix D to your main CPO proof of evidence. So let's just work our way through this. So plot 1, this is one of the 2 plots owned by the Sir J.V. Wills, or the trustees of the Sir J.V. Wills Trust. We can see where that is on the order map, and we can see also on the plan, the road improvement plan drawing, what is shown. Just explain why there is the need for acquisition there, and you might need, the inspectors may have seen it, but you might need to just explain the point about the quarry and the land that is at the kind of higher road level, and then how that drops away.
Yes, I think what might help is if I just briefly describe the levels of the route as you go from south to north. So at roundabout 1, the airport main access roundabout that I described, you're up at about 179 metres roughly, and then the A38 as you head north gradually drops down the hill, dropping down to around about 168 metres at the downside road junction, and then it drops slightly further as you go north to around just over 165. Then it starts to raise up again as it goes past West Lane. So just to give you a bit of context, that we're going down the hill and then back up a hill. As you proceed down the hill towards Downside Road, on your left you reach plot 1. In this location, we are proposing to widen the road to provide 2 full lanes in each direction, plus a left turn lane into Downside Road, plus a new 3.5 metre pedestrian cycle facility over a 13.5 metre widening. In addition to that, the land to the west, which on the OS plan is labelled Disused Quarry, which is land parcel 1, self-explanatory, a historic quarry. Not a great deal is known about it, but it was heavily vegetated. There's been some clearance recently that you'll see if you go up and have a look tomorrow. That quarry, the line that you can see, the sort of upside down question mark, is the main bulk of the quarry excavation. That's a very deep hole in the middle of the site, and in fact is so difficult to access that the survey company that was sent out refused to go in there because of the risks of the slope stability and the level change. One thing we do know is that we need to widen in this area on both the A38 and Downside Road, where we're adding an additional lane out of Downside Road and a new right turn lane into the Airport Tavern junction. So that eats fairly significantly into that corner. The land around that corner is slightly higher than the road level as well, so there's the need to introduce an embankment of some sort to make that work. You'll see again, if you look out there at the moment, there's a small retaining wall in that location. One of the main reasons for us needing to acquire Plot 1 in particular is that the safe working area around that finished highway scheme needs to be something in the order of 5 to 10 metres wide, and maybe even more depending on what is found. What we must do, or what the contractors must do, is make safe that whole working area, and we believe we need to gain access to the quarry and shore up any areas of weakness. The other information that's pertinent to this is which I'll come on to later on, is the highway drainage scheme. There is a need to provide a large area of underground attenuation for the new highway drainage, and it's proposed to put that drainage attenuation in the corner of that plot, in the sort of northeasternmost corner. That's quite a large attenuation facility that needs to go in there, and will it certainly take up the whole of Plot 2 and may partly go into Plot 1. So again, we need very sure and safe access to that whole area to be able to construct those elements of the scheme. So that's Plot 1. Plot 2 then is really self-evidently is the majority of the land where the new highway is going that I described, the widening of the A38, the widening of Downside Road, and the new foot cycleway. There are also quite extensive as you would imagine with any major road corridor, there are extensive utilities running either side of that road and along Downside Road. In this case, the largest of which, or the highest risk of which, are two underground 33 kV cables that run along the western edge of the A38 as existing. There's also an underground 11 kV cable, and that runs along the western edge of the A38, then turns left into Downside Road. We haven't done detailed surveys in terms of trial holes for those, so it depends on the depth of cover whether those will need to be diverted into that space, or they can stay where they are under the carriageway. If they have around about 900 millimetres cover, then we may be able to agree with Western Power that they can stay where they are. If they haven't got that cover and Western Power are not comfortable with that, then we will need to divert those underground electricity cables into that parcel of land. So there will be a requirement to do that.
So that's the two plots owned by the trustees of the Sir J.V. Wills Will Trust, insofar as Saunders on their behalf have set out, more broad objections. Those are sort of picked up, I think, in your evidence and or Mr. Church's written evidence, and I think we don't need to particularly go through that, but I think it's helpful to get you to just explain why the land is needed. Are you content now to go on to the Hawthorne leisure plots?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. What I'll do now is just mention
So
that...
I should say, was there anything else that either of you wanted to just ask at that stage? So we're now going to go on to the next series of plots, which are owned by Hawthorne Leisure, but in which Mr. Lane has a lease and the Airport Tavern is occupier.
Yes, absolutely. At this point, I'll just elaborate a bit on the drainage, because it affects both landowners. The bulk of the existing highway drainage is in an attenuation facility just to the south of the existing bus stop. So where, if you can see plot 5, where it says shelter, then just south of there's an inspection chamber into an underground attenuation tank in there. That's quite important. That attenuation tank has a catchment of 8,600 or so metres squared, the existing carriageway. We're adding around about 3,200 metres squared of hard standing that would need to be drained. So our proposal, as I mentioned, is to put in a new underground attenuation in plot 2 to increase that capacity. The new chamber we're proposing would be around about 4,800 metres squared worth of attenuation. What that does is gives the Highway Authority betterment. It reduces the storage requirement of the existing facility to just around about 7,100 metres squared. That's quite important because there were some historic instances of highway flooding that may have been because of blocked highway drains. It may have been because of lack of capacity in the attenuation tank. So there's some increased value in the mitigation there. The other piece to this is that of course all of those drainage channels that run along the existing edge of the A38 will need to be relocated as part of the work, so they will all be moved over and tied into those new attenuation facilities that will be provided. Moving on to the specifics then of the Hawthorne leisure land, the A38 widening continues through, as I mentioned, 2 lanes in each direction, northbound. The inability to widen on the eastern side is a constraint. We would have affected a lot more properties, and there would have been a lot more constraint in addition to the need to take more common land. So it was decided early on to try to design the scheme in the best manner possible, but also minimise land take to the west wherever possible. So we have come up with this design, this widened scheme. But what that does mean is it eats into the frontage of the Airport Tavern. That frontage at the moment is effectively an open access frontage with direct access onto the A38. There is no formal junction into that plot or that tavern. We had a lot of discussion in the planning appeal about design manuals and design guidelines and standards. This is one case where the new scheme is being built and it wouldn't have been proper to leave that fully open. We're putting in a new pedestrian route along there. We're trying to rationalise the accesses and make them safer. And the best way to achieve that was to relocate the Airport Tavern access onto Downside Road. I'm strongly of the view that that's an improvement in access for the tavern and a significant improvement in safety for all road users, because we would no longer have reversing cars coming out onto the main A38. Particularly important when we're widening the road not to have that. So that frontage is taken. That results in a loss of some car parking along the frontage. The Airport Tavern site itself is about 0.7 metres below where the finished road level is, or where the current road level is, which will be extended out. So there is a need to introduce structural retaining features in there, we are moving closer to the Airport Tavern building itself, so there will need to be some structural retaining feature in there to allow for that level difference between the road and the new footway and the drop down into Airport Tavern. Part of Plot 4 goes along the frontage of the tavern, so the big part of it is to the west or the southwest, but there is a strip along the frontage. The reason we need access there is to be able to build those retaining structures in front of the building, and again, safe working areas for the contractors. The bulk of Plot 4 to the other side, to the west, is being acquired in order for us to deliver the new access that I just described. At that point, at that end of the site, there's a level difference of between 1 and 1.3 metres. So not only do we need to provide a safe new access with its new right turn lane in, we also need to provide a slope down into the Airport Tavern car park. So we need that depth to be able to build that new slope road down into the car park. As you head north up the scheme, you will see slivers 8 and 9 proposed to be permanently acquired. So those are simply to accommodate the widening and the new footway. And beyond that, you'll see there's on the scheme drawing there what looks like a small squiggle in front of Airport Tavern. That's to provide them with a new ramped access down. So this 0.7 metre level difference is so that customers could still easily access that footway by using the ramp down. There's also a new set of steps proposed at the downside road corner of the junction. So two ways in, plus of course pedestrians could come in from the new vehicular access to the west. So those two slivers are to accommodate the widening and utilities diversions. As you head further north, plots 5 and 6, which are much wider, again this is to enable contractors to get in there and reprofile the ground and make safe those areas to accommodate that level difference. It becomes slightly steeper there. It can go from around about 0.7 at Airport Tavern up to between 1 and 1.5 metres at its steepest point. So the intention there is to permanently acquire the strips along the front to enable us to build the highway scheme, but also have that land to the back for safe access for contractors' vehicles and creating either the retaining wall or the embankment that will be needed to allow for that and accommodate that level difference. Similarly, as I mentioned before, we have the 33 kV underground cable to either leave where it is or divert into that land. So that's the other main aspect of that piece of land. I think that covers all of the...
I think it does. There are odd little pieces like plot 7, which is a tiny
Yes,
corner.
plot 7's right in the corner. There's an inset. So yeah, again, that needs to be permanently acquired to create the new junction onto the A38. And
so that
yes, and there's in plot 3 there's a post box to be diverted as well.
So that deals with plots 3 to plot 8, which are the Hawthorne leisure plots and where Mr. Lane is the lessee. So we can then go on to some of the other plots, and as we go through the plot numbers, we will slightly move between different ownerships. So to take this in whatever order seems most logical. I think you've already mentioned, in fact, plot 9 when you were mentioning
Yes.
plot 8, because those are both plots which are required for the construction of the new carriageway. So as we move a little bit further up, we get to plot 10 and the what I suppose I could call some of the Oakwood plots.
Yes. Yeah.
Why don't you take us through those, please? So we're going 10, 11, 12,
Yes,
13,
so
14, 15.
similar to plot 5 and 6 in this case, this is where there is still quite a reasonable level difference between the carriageway level and the ground level to the west. The illustration shows the 10, 12 and 14 indicatively to be permanently acquired to accommodate the physical works, so the widening of the road, the provision of the new footway, and any retaining structures that would need to be put in behind that, and then the plots to the rear, 11, 13 and 15. Oh, actually, I've jumped to landowner, haven't I? So 11, 13 and 15 are, again, for that safe working area for contractors and enough room to be able to create those retaining structures or embankment to accommodate the widening. So it's essentially in that case simply to accommodate the highway widening and new footway provision and to enable contractors access to build whatever retaining structure or embankment is needed in those areas, including any necessity to divert any utilities away out of the carriageway into the footway or verge.
And then does that get us to the end of that series of plots?
Yes, that takes you up to 15, which is the northernmost plot.
Was there again, in case the inspectors had any questions on those ones? No. So I think we can now continue with the numbering. We cross over to the east side of the A38. We're now on plots 16 and 17. And we go 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 are all national highways plots, and these are
Yes.
the various plots on the east side of the A38 north of West Lane. So again, just talk us through the need for that land.
Yes, this is the area where the majority of the widening is on the east side of the A38. And again, the rationale for the acquisition here is to construct the new carriageway, so the widening to 2 lanes approaching the what would be the new West Lane traffic signals, and accommodate the 2-lane exit heading north from those signals. That requires land take into those areas, those national highways owned areas. So the bulk of it is to accommodate the new carriageway and new footway that's proposed to be built heading north of West Lane, and to accommodate any utilities diversions in a similar way that we had to do on the other side for the other plots of land, and again temporary working access for contractors to be able to get in there and build that widening scheme.
And we can just note, not primarily a matter for you, but in the schedule that we've got, plot 21 in the right-hand column, just the second entry in the right-hand column, that's the plot of land that may be common land, and I touched on that in opening, and the inspector will be familiar with that, but that's,
Yes.
you can see where that plot is.
Yeah, I think that one's quite important, because whilst we're not sure of the status of the land, we have absolutely sought to minimise the impact on that. So that's why the quadrant into the junction is designed that way. It was necessary to change the layout slightly and to improve that quadrant at the traffic signal, but also in a way that sought to minimise impact on Felton Common. As I mentioned earlier, that's the reason, one of the reasons why there isn't any widening south of that point.
Yes. Yeah. And I said, sir, in opening that I would just check in relation to that information that we needed from the council. My understanding is we've received everything we need, and it's in that context that the Secretary of State has indicated that the Section 19 certificate may be issued. So I think that loose end is no longer a loose end. And then we just get to the final plot, which is further to the south, but still on the eastern side. This is the various plots that front onto Lilac Cottage. And again, just explain why that's needed.
Yes, the scheme requires the removal of the existing traffic islands to widen the road and create new islands and create a completely new traffic signal junction. The access to Lilac Cottage does already have a traffic signal on it, but we'll need to replace that and reconfigure it. So there is need to access the land to access those areas. It's a very tight highway boundary there, so we will need to get behind that to be able to do that. So contractors will need those strips of land to be able to get in and access those areas. There may also be the need for some minor utilities diversions through that section as well, and relaying of new cabling for traffic signals and street lighting, for example. So there isn't, overall the scheme isn't being widened to the east, but we do need to reconfigure that junction and make that access part of the new junction and as safe as possible. So it's important to be able to gain access to that land beyond the highway boundary in order to complete the work safely.
So, Mr. Witchells, is there anything else that you need to add? And then I'm going to check whether the inspectors have any questions for you. I'm not suggesting that there is.
No, I don't think so.
So, Madam, I don't know whether you have questions. I'm hoping that we've managed to cover the things that you would want to know about.
Yeah, I'm absolutely fine. I'm building a sort of series of post-it notes that I'm pulling off the proof as we go through. And for this witness, yeah, they're all off. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Great.
That's excellent. And this witness has been just focusing on the sort of, if I can call it like this, the physical aspects of each plot and justification. Mr. Witchells, thank you very much. If you can pack away your things, down to the mic for a moment. And then we'll get Mr. Church to take your place.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So I'll introduce Mr. Church very briefly. Is your name Henry Church?
It is.
And you're a member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors and a senior director in the firm CBRE, and you have over 20 years' experience of providing advice on compulsory purchase and compensation matters. I think you're also, I don't know whether you mentioned it in here, but I think you're also the treasurer of the Compulsory Purchase Association.
And vice chairman. The rest is correct, yeah.
And vice chairman, sorry, I forgot you also had that.
Only elected earlier this week, last week, so forgive me.
Mr. Church, you set out obviously the rest of your qualifications and experience in section 1 of your evidence. I've no need for me to take you through that. You have a main proof of evidence, a summary and a supplementary. So what I'm going to ask you to do is read through the summary.
Sorry, I think we've got a slight technical problem. Okay.
Sorry, say that again, sir.
I'm going to get you to read through the summary, but when we get to the section where you deal with the individual parties, we'll deal with those parties that still have live objections. I suggest in relation to North Somerset Council, we can probably skip over that, and we can, as we're going through, we can use the schedule that's been handed in this morning, and you can just update the inspectors on the latest position. So if you just start by reading from your section 2 in your summary.
Indeed.
And then I'll stop you and we can discuss some of the issues in relation to particular objectives.
Okay, thank you. My evidence covers approach to acquisitions, a summary of negotiations to acquire required interest by agreement, a summary of the remaining objections, and a summary of my response to those issues that fall within the scope of my evidence. In carrying out my instructions, I have been assisted by my colleague John Gunthorpe, who is a director in the CBRE CPO team, and other professional advisors to Bristol Airport Limited and Bristol Airport Limited employees. A brief overview of the scheme is set out in my original proof. The Bristol Airport Limited land at A38 and Downside Road compulsory purchase order 2020. The order was made on the 15th of September 2020. To section 4, securing powers. I'm advised that BAL is the relevant airport operator for Bristol Airport, being the company responsible for the management of the airport. BAL is using powers enabled by section 59 of the Airports Act. While some of the order land is required only for construction purposes, I am advised that the compulsory purchase powers available to BAL do not allow it to compulsorily acquire new rights over land for use as construction areas for the off-airport highway works or take temporary possession of it. BAL must acquire the order land permanently, even on plots where BAL does not propose to undertake permanent highway works. Therefore, freehold interests are being sought over all of the order land, with the undertaking that BAL will offer back land to the original landowners, which is not required permanently, subject to BAL retaining any necessary rights, for example, to diverted services and drainage, and subject to other terms being agreed, including compensation. The order land falling within this category is plots 4, 6, 11, 13, 15, 17 and 22, and shaded blue on the plan at Appendix HC1. Note that plot 1 is shaded blue erroneously on that. BAL continues to negotiate with affected parties to acquire the necessary use of the land and rights by agreement. Compliance with MHCLG guidance on the use of powers. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government's guidance on compulsory purchase process and the Critchell Down rules from July 2019 provides a step-by-step guide to those bodies proposing to compulsorily acquire land. I set out in my proof how BAL has demonstrated an ability to acquire interest by agreement, sought to engage with landowners, kept them informed of the progress of the scheme, and actively sought and positively participated in discussions with those owners. I also confirm that BAL has undertaken to meet the reasonable professional fees and costs incurred by those with whom it has been negotiating. Land handback. Where land is only required for temporary construction purposes, however, then BAL undertakes to offer such surplus land back to the existing landowner, subject to the need to retain any rights, for example, for diverted utilities and highway verge, and subject to the agreement of compensation. Sorry, that's a bit repetitive there. Moving to section 5, overview. BAL received 32 objections to the order, of which 2 related to the acquisition of an interest in land, covering 8 plots in the order, with a third from North Somerset Council. It is unclear whether NSC owns any land within the order boundaries, but it has occupier interests in respect to public footpaths and as the Highway Authority. 29 objections were based on an objection to the proposed expansion of the airport. This section of my summary proof deals with those objectors who have an interest in land to be acquired under the order. An appendix, signposting of responses to objections, is attached to my evidence at Appendix HC6, which summarises the objections received to the order and identifies where the response is provided in BAL's evidence. In addition, I attach at Appendix HC5 to my evidence a statement from Simon Priest, Commercial Director at BAL, and Andrew Griffiths, the Chief Financial Officer at BAL, who respond to objections relevant to BAL's position as the acquiring authority. Background and context. Although BAL recommended that affected parties are represented by professional advisors and indeed offered to pay reasonable fees, in fact only some of the affected parties are so represented.
Now, pause there for a moment. So what I'm going to suggest we do so that the inspectors have this by reference to the schedule, so we'll look at the schedule and we'll then dip into the summary proof to just expand on that. So in the schedule, plots 1 and 2 are the plots that we've discussed in relation to the trustees of Sir J.V. Will's will trust. And Mr. Witchell's explained why that land is needed. You deal with that on your page 9, and in your supplementary there's a very brief update. So perhaps if you sort of read your paragraph 5, 15, 16, 17, 18, and if necessary 19, but give us any further update that you need to in relation to the trust.
Indeed. An overview and consideration of the effects of the scheme are set out in my main report. The Sir J.V. Will's Will Trust are the freehold owners of the former quarry land at Downside Road. It is my understanding that the land is currently vacant and is not currently put to any identified use by the owner. A ground of objection made by the Trust is that BAL has not sought to negotiate. A number of offers have been made by or on behalf of Bristol Airport Limited to the Trust, and as would be expected in commercial negotiations, these offers have evolved over time as further information has come to light. BAL continues to seek to acquire the necessary interest from the Trust by agreement, but if this is not possible, a disagreement over compensation is not a matter that should prevent the confirmation of the order. If agreement cannot be reached in due course and the order is confirmed and powers implemented, then the Trust would have the option of pursuing a claim through the Upper Tribunal Lands Chamber. Negotiations are continuing with Lucy Back of Sword as representing the affected parties. I then went on to say that although BA will continue with reasonable efforts to acquire the required land by agreement, it requires the certainty of land assembled by the order, afforded by the order should negotiations remain outstanding. I then provided a brief update in my supplementary at para 2.5 to say that an offer to enter into a contract guaranteeing a minimum payment of compensation, what might otherwise be known as a Lands Tribunal contract, and subject to any increased sums awarded by the Upper Tribunal or the Lands Chamber in the event that compensation cannot be agreed, was made to Ms Black, acting on behalf of the Trust, on the 25th of May and remains open for acceptance. Subsequent to that, she has written to you, to the inquiry, advising that the offer has been rejected. So that may be the case, but the offer remains open to it for acceptance.
So in the schedule, sir, you'll see in the third substantive column, objection, yes, no, withdrawn, there's a reference to the June 2021 statement of case. That's this document. And to a letter of the 27th of September. That's, I think, the one that you referred to.
It was. This is the one where, should we say, that they've accepted that there are discussions, but obviously the offer has been rejected. But yeah.
And in the statement of case, so if I just be permitted to sort of deal with this slightly informally light touch, section 2 was not all of the land in my client's ownership is needed for the scheme. That's why I've got Mr. Witchell's to go through that. 3 is attempts made to acquire the land by private treaty are inadequate. This is, in a sense, the point that Mr. Church has been dealing with. Offers have been made, they have been rejected. 3 was impacts from COVID-19. This is, in effect, a forecasting point that there won't be recovery. And that's where we've pointed to Mr. Brass's evidence, and then there's a general point about the proposed scheme is not in the public interest, and the council has refused. So those have been dealt with in the written evidence. So is there anything else on that one that you need from us in terms of understanding our position? No. Thank you then, Ms. Church. So we'll go on in the schedule to the next plots, which are 3 to 8. And these are the Hawthorne leisure plots. These are also the plots in which Mr. Lane has an interest in lessee, but his objection has been withdrawn. And so perhaps you can just go in your summary, it's really paragraph 5.7, just to give us the overview of Hawthorne leisure, and then like I did last time, just sort of update us on anything that's happened very recently.
So, as before, an overview and consideration of the effects of the scheme are set out in my main report. Hawthorne Leisure Mantle Limited, Hawthorne Leisure for short, is the freehold owner of the property known as the Airport Tavern. A ground of objection from Hawthorne Leisure is that BAL has not sought to negotiate. As this demonstrates, this is manifestly not true. Not only has BAL negotiated, but it remains willing to do so. The scheme requires, a typo there, plots 3 to 8, partly for highway improvements and part to facilitate construction. Of these, only plots 3, 5, 7 and 8 are required permanently, with plots 4 and 6 required only temporarily. A new access is proposed to be constructed to the public house from Downside Road, if you see my appendix HC9 in my main report. The land to be acquired includes part of the car park and land at the frontage of the public house. Part of Hawthorne Leisure's objection is that the residual land post-CPO would be commercially unviable. However, given assurances over access, which have been given, I can see no reason why the public house cannot continue to trade following the completion of the works and the operation of the scheme. The retained land includes the totality of the public house with an improved access via Downside Road. As the schedule of contact at Appendix HC2 shows, engagement commenced between BAL and New River REIT in November 2017. They're the controlling body of Hawthorne Leisure, and has been maintained on a regular basis since this time. I then went on to say that negotiations were continuing with them. I updated that, so Madam, in my supplementary at paras 2.2 to 2.4. I said a meeting was held with Edward Little of Hawthorne Leisure on the 24th of June, where an explanation was provided for the basis of BAL's most recent offer. During the call, a counter-proposal was made by Mr. Little. Mr. Little was advised instructions would be sought from BAL and a follow-up call arranged. A follow-up meeting was held with Mr. Little on the 26th of August 2021, and a revised offer was made orally to him, to Mr. Little, who advised that he felt the offer was fair and he would recommend it be accepted by Hawthorne Leisure. Formal confirmation is awaited that the offer is accepted, and a formal written agreement can then be progressed. And as I say in the schedule, that situation remains current. We are chasing them for updates and not getting much back. In fact, a colleague of mine has put a call into them today. There may be, in part, a delay, because you may have picked up in the press, Sarah Madam, that Hawthorne Leisure is currently been subject to a transaction or an agreement to transfer, and that may be a problem in them progressing it, but that's where we currently are.
And so in relation to this one, as you'll see, the schedule in that objection column refers to the letter from CMS, the solicitors, dated 29th of June 2021. That was a that was a brief letter that identified the plots and that there hadn't been progress with the discussions, but it appended an earlier letter of 15th of October 2020, which set out Hawthorne Leisure's objection and set out various headings, and because obviously that was 15th of October 2020, that's been picked up and responded to in our written material under the, I think, the thematic basis, so you should have the responses to all of that, but things including absence of a compelling case, absence of implementable scheme or timetable for delivery, absence of funding or lack of financial viability, failure to use reasonable endeavours to negotiate, residual land left following compulsory acquisition not viable, failure to consider alternatives to compulsory purchase, and general prematurity, and all of those points we have responded to. So going through again the schedule, if we turn now to the, what I'll call the Oakwood Plots, so those northernmost plots on the west side of the A38, so plots 10 through to 15, with Mr. Gould, who appears since the 24th of July to have had a lease. I think you picked this up in your supplementary. And then there are the tenants, Mr. Williams, Oakwood Parking Limited, Vicky Hassel, and I think for some of those, North Somerset Council is occupier in respect of the footpath. So if we just pick that.
Shall I deal with Mr. Gould and Mr. Williams together?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Because the two are inextricably linked in a way that I haven't fully got to the bottom of yet. We may come to that in a moment.
So this is your
from my
summary proof, paragraph 4.3. Obviously, there's more detail in the main proof, but paragraph 4.3.
4.3.
I got that right?
Yeah, that's the supplementary proof. Proof.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
The summary proof, we're at 6.2, in which I said an overview and consideration of the effects of the scheme I'll set out in my main report. Although negotiations are continuing with each affected party, Bristol Airport requires the certainty of land assembly afforded by the order should the agreement not be completed prior to the order being confirmed, and therefore needs to progress the order. I then update the situation in relation to Mr. Gould, who's the freeholder of the property, at para 4.3. And I say, in my main proof, I stated that we had been informed that Oakwood House, or part of it, was let to Mr. Christopher Williams on an assured short-hold tenancy. We were subsequently advised by Mr. Gould's agent that Oakwood House, or part of it, was to be re-let to Mr. Christopher Williams by a lease excluded from the security of tenure provisions of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. This lease completed on the 24th of July 2021, and I attach a copy. And just whilst dealing with that, that was a product of the fact that there's evidently a car parking operation being run from this property. And it appears by Mr. Williams, although possibly by Mr. Gould as well, and clearly that kind of operation isn't appropriate under an assured short-hold tenancy because that deals just with residential property. So a commercial lease makes sense in that regard. So I then went on to say, I have been engaging with Mr. Gould's agent to seek to better understand the implications of this, that is the new lease, and in particular the nature of the landlord's business referred to at clause 4 in the lease, albeit not defined, and the operational arrangements. This states at clause 4, the lease is granted in order to allow the tenant, that's Mr. Williams, to carry on the business of house share, the property is a house in multiple occupation, and the landlord's business in the premises. the approved business, and for no other purpose whatsoever unless approved in writing by the landlord. So we're not quite clear what the approved business actually is. These discussions continue until I understand the extent of the interests of the parties in the land to be acquired, and indeed the land to be acquired, the full interest in the land. It is not possible to progress the private treaty negotiation. The application for a certificate of lawfulness referred to in my para 6.13 of my proof of evidence was for the parking of vehicles which are not incidental to the lawful use of the site and as an airport parking transfer point. That is, if you want to park your car there, you take it there, they take it away, park it somewhere else, take you to the airport. That reference, 20/P/0910/LDE, submitted to North Somerset Council on the 22nd of April 2020, has not yet been determined. I have just discovered that a further application for a certificate of lawfulness for the change of use of land from garden land used incidentally to Oakwood House to use as a residential caravan site associated with garden land was submitted to the Council on the 14th of May and is still awaiting determination. I don't know the outcome of either of those, I must forget. But
so if we just pause for a moment, in the schedule, we just need to correct something. It's in fact completely my error. I typed something in under the wrong heading. Against plot 10, Anthony Gould, it says in brackets afterwards, now lessee under lease dated 24th of July 2021. That, in parentheses, comment should be against Mr. Williams. Mr. Gould's, in fact, the landlord. It's Mr. Williams.
The lessor.
Yeah.
If the E became an or, we're in business.
Okay. If we add that Mr. Williams is now the lessee, apologies for that. And then over the page in the update, you had a section on
Mr. Gould, Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
So as I indicated at para 4.3, subsequent to my submission of my proof, Mr. Gould and Mr. Williams have entered into a new lease. I'm in ongoing negotiations with Mr. Williams' agent, who is also acting for Mr. Gould, which is why I suggested we deal with the two together, because there is clearly a link. As to the implications of this agreement, as above, until I understand the exact extent of the interests of the parties in land to be acquired, it is not possible to progress the private treaty negotiation. I might just mention, when you undertake a site visit, you'll know that to the south of the property is a mobile home, which doesn't have planning, which explains the certificate of lawfulness application.
Then in the schedule we have Vicky Hassel, brackets occupier.
Yes.
I think not very much is known about Vicky Hassel.
Neither us nor the agent for the freeholder or lessee have been able to identify Vicky Hassel, and it may be that she was an occupier of the property, which is, as I said, an HMO at the time when the referencing was undertaken, and has subsequently moved on.
So it's been, as Church explained, a house in multiple occupation. When the referencer turned up, it may be, so far as we know, that she answered the door and said, you know, I'm Vicky Hassel, and I'm an occupier here, but no one seems to know who she is, so she's formally identified, but we don't know who she is. And that then takes us through all of those plots. We get then to plots 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20 and 21. And there was actually a previous plot, wasn't there? 9 is also Highways England, or National Highways. But again, just in relation to those, the simple point here, there's no objection from them. The road, we can see, has been detrunked. The land should have been transferred. And all our discussions really have been with the council.
Yeah, as Highway Authority.
And then the final plot, 22, and there are a number of different interests there other than the council's, which is withdrawn. No objection from those. But again, do you want to just...
Yeah, Lindsay Lim and Wedlake are on the east side of the A38, so opposite the Airport Tavern, and they have an access point, which you'll see in your site visit, comes up there, and which we're maintaining. It's a traffic light signal junction.
So in your summary, you deal with them at paragraphs 6.4, 5, 6, and 7, 8, and 9.
Yeah.
So perhaps just read through those bits.
6.4, an overview and consideration of the effects of the scheme I'll set out in my main report. This relates to Lindsay and Lim. 6.5, BAL has confirmed that it will work with the owners and occupiers of Lilac Cottages, the properties that I've just referred to, the residential units, to ensure access to those properties is maintained during the construction period. From the following completion of the works, there will be little or no impact to the affected parties' land interests. Their properties will remain accessible throughout the scheme. And in relation to Mr. Wedlake, similar comments and overview and consideration of the effects of the scheme I set out in my main report. BAL has confirmed that it will work with Mr. Wedlake to ensure access maintained to his business during the construction works. Following completion of the works, there will be little or no impact on Mr. Wedlake's land interest. He has a motel type operation, which I think also has an element of car parking. And whilst we just talk about the car parking, just for clarity's sake, when you go out on site, Mr. Lane Airport Tavern runs a car parking operation. They are all separate.
And then in the summary, your section 7 just deals with the two plots that have been acquired, or rather than plots, the two properties that have been acquired. And just for form's sake, if you could just take the inspectors to those, so you'll see those two properties, substantial properties, south of plots 1 and 2, with access off downside road. So the access runs down the side of plot 1 and into those properties. They have no access
directly onto the A38.
Just so
right. So as I say at 7.1, I and members of the BAL team have sought to engage with all affected parties, as we've discussed, not only those who objected. Set out below is a summary of those parties where agreement has been concluded. So it relates to Mr. David and Mrs. Francis Jutson, apologies if that's not quite the right pronunciation, who were the freehold owners of Green Acres, and Rachel Wilton, who was the freehold owner of Highlands. And I went on to say, BAL and the affected parties have concluded agreements and the land has been transferred to BAL. In my view, these agreements provide evidence of BAL's real ability and desire to acquire land by agreement in accordance with its obligations under the guidance that I referred to earlier.
And so you'll see obviously that for obvious reasons those plots are not within the order, but they are properties over which some of the widening works will be undertaken. And that's obvious when you compare the plans with the works drawings. Firstly, Mr. Church, is there anything you want to add, having gone through all the plots?
So this now?
No, sir, madam?
Yeah, I've just got one thing, if I may. In relation to those properties where negotiations are ongoing, you've set out the position. Plot 10, Gould, Williams and Vicky Hassel. You've explained where you are, and there are certain things outstanding with the council, etc., etc. Am I right in taking from what you've said that the likelihood of settling that matter is probably rather less than some of the others?
I want to give you one answer, but the other is, I fear you may be correct. It's just negotiations are quite slow.
Yeah, I mean, that was the impression that I was getting.
Yes. There's no reason, fundamentally, why we couldn't. I mean, it appears that they're possibly trying to get their ducks in a row, sorting out regularising planning and regularising the lease situation. And it may be that it changes, but questions are asked and answers do come back, but they do take quite a long time.
Okay.
But you know, I will continue to talk to their agent.
Yeah, that's useful. It's just, I was getting a sort of flavour of it. I just wanted to make sure that the flavour I was getting was the flavour that you were explaining. That's fine. Okay, I've got nothing further.
So I think that is my evidence on the compulsory purchase order.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
You'll be relieved to know, sir, there isn't some huge closing statement on this. In fact, there isn't any written closing statement on this at all, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
You know, I would just simply formally say, for the reasons set out in our opening statement for the CPO section of the inquiry and our written evidence, and obviously insofar as is appropriate, relying on our evidence in the planning inquiry, we ask that you recommend that the compulsory purchase order is confirmed.
Thank you for that. And in fact, that just reminds me, during the course of the inquiry this morning, we've had a letter from Department for Transport, which I gather is as strong as they ever get, saying that it will be a report to the Secretary of State.
Thank you.
So that's, I don't think we're going to be going back on that now. They've confirmed it in a pretty strong way.
Yes,
So,
so for the reasons I explained in those early paragraphs of the opening, I think you know, we understand how the procedure will work. These things do happen from time to time in this particular way. I think it's perfectly you know, appropriate, and you will obviously need to issue your decision on the planning appeal, and that will then be obviously a material consideration in the determination of the confirmation decision. So thank you very much for confirming that.
okay. Okay, thank you very much indeed. On that basis, this very short inquiry is now closed. Thank you.
You.